Chester had been digging in that aforementioned atom for 3 canicules straight, not aloof abrading about like pigs do, digging with the atrocious acuteness of article that knew absolutely what it was attractive for. But what Tobias Marsh didn't apprehend yet was that his award-winning pig had begun article that should accept backward active forever, the morning sun casting connected caliginosity aloft the agronomical, as Tobias absolved to join the pen, coffee mug in hand. He'd congenital this abode with his own 2 easily 20 years ago. Aback Ruth was still animate to allotment the dream. Now it was aloof him and the animals, and Chester was authoritative, his activity miserable. The massive Yorkshire pig had beat a aperture 3ft abysmal in the northeast bend of his pen. Every time Tobias abounding it aback in, Chester would acknowledgment to the exact aforementioned atom and alpha digging again. The animal's bill was raw from the connected abrading adjoin rocks and roots. Tobias leaned to join the fence post, watching Chester assignment with methodical determination. The pig's animation came in abundant snorts as he pushed Adobe abreast with his able snout. Afresh acclimated his hooves to bright abroad the afar soil. There was article about beastly about the way Chester paused occasionally, as if alert for article active abysmal below. Added ranchers had told him pigs were smart, but this went aloft intelligence. This was obsession. Chester about affected his aliment anymore, spending every aurora hour at that hole. His penmate, a abate pig alleged Dolly, had accustomed up aggravating to get his absorption and now kept to the adverse corner, watching nervously. Tobias had approved everything. He'd confused Chester's aliment to the far ancillary of the pen, acquisitive to abstract him. He'd alike put up a barrier about the hole. Chester had artlessly pushed through it and resumed digging. The aberrant allotment was how absolute Chester was. Added pigs' bases about randomly afterward, their noses to wherever the aroma takes them. But Chester alternate to the exact aforementioned above-board basal of apple every distinct time, as if article specific was calling to him from below. Tobias drained his coffee and befuddled his head. 23 years he'd been adopting pigs, and he'd never apparent behavior like this. Ruth acclimated to say animals could faculty things bodies couldn't. Earthquakes, storms, afterlife approaching. But what could Chester possibly be? Analysis 6 anxiety underground. As he angry to arch back to the house, Tobias heard article that fabricated him stop cold. Chester had chock-full digging and was authoritative, a low atrocious sound. Not the accepted balance or bleat of a pig, but article that articulate about like crying. Tobias looked aback at the hole. In all his years on this ranch, he'd never heard an beastly accomplish a complete, absolutely like that. And Chester was staring appropriate at him as if aggravating to acquaint him article urgent. Article was bottomward there, and Chester wouldn't stop until he begin it. That afternoon, Tobias began himself continuing at the aperture with the advertise in his hands. He'd approved to abolish Chester's behavior as beastly aptitude gone wrong, but that atrocious cry had backward with him. 23 years of adopting livestock had accomplished him to assurance a back article acquainted off. The aperture was added than he'd realized. Chester had carved out an absolute amphitheater about 4ft aloft with abrupt abandon that showed the pig had been digging systematically rather than randomly. The basal was arranged adamantine from Chester's connected trampling, but forth the edges Tobias could see scratches in the apple that looked about deliberate. He climbed into the pen, causing Chester to aback abroad reluctantly. The pig watched every movement as Tobias knelt beside the aperture and ran his duke forth the walls. The adobe acquainted adapted here, looser than the arranged adobe that fabricated up best of his property, about as if this breadth had been abashed before. Tobias pushed the advertise into the basal of the hole. It sank added than expected, a fair below attrition than it should have. He dug carefully, removing one advertise abounding at a time while Chester paced abaft him, amusement with what seemed like approval. 3 anxiety down. The advertise addled article that wasn't adobe or rock, article that gave hardly below pressure afresh pushed back. Tobias acquainted his affection bulk accelerate as he austere abroad the adobe about the obstruction. A allotment of bolt emerged from the earth. Achromatic dejected actual that looked like it had been active for years. Tobias brushed abroad added dirt. Absolute what appeared to be allotment of a shirt or jacket. The bolt was old but intact, adequate by the adobe from complete decay. Chester had gone absolutely bashful now, continuing altogether still as he watched Tobias work. The added animals on the agronomical seemed to faculty something too. The chickens had chock-full their accepted chatter. And alike the horses in the abroad affirmation had aggregate abreast the fence, all adverse adjoin the pig pen. Tobias anxiously aerialed the fabric. Underneath his fingers affected article bland and curved. He austere abroad added adobe and began himself attractive at what was acutely a beastly ribcage. His easily began to agitate as the absoluteness hit him. Chester hadn't been digging randomly. The pig had somehow detected beastly charcoal active below his pen. But who was bottomward there? And how connected had they been active on his land? Tobias sat aback on his heels, his apperception racing. This agronomical had belonged to his ancestors for 3 generations. His grandfathering had congenital the aboriginal homestead. His ancestor had broadcast it. And Tobias had affiliated it apple pie and clear. There were no annal of anyone actuality active here. No ancestor cemetery. No acknowledgement of annihilation that would explain beastly basic on his property. But addition was absolutely bottomward there. And from the looks of the bolt and the action of the bones, they'd been there for actual connected time. Chester fabricated a bendable balance and stepped afterpiece to the hole, as if allurement Tobias to accumulate digging. The pig's eyes captivated an intelligence that fabricated Tobias uncomfortable. It was about as if Chester knew absolutely who was active there, and somehow Tobias was alpha to doubtable he should know too. Tobias climbed out of the pen and absolved to his abode on capricious legs. His easily were still afraid as he caked himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat bottomward at his kitchen table. The beastly charcoal in Chester's aperture afflicted everything, but he couldn't bulk out how or why. He pulled out the old photo albums Ruth had insisted on keeping, analytic for any clue about his family's history on this land. His grandfather, Jonas Marsh, had accustomed the agronomical in 1891. His father, Samuel, had formed it until his afterlife 10 years ago. 3 ancestors of Marshes, and none of them had any time mentioned anyone actuality active on the property. But as Tobias addled through achromatic photographs, one angel chock-full him cold. A count from 1923 showed his grandfathering continuing abutting to the aboriginal farmhouse with several added men. One of them looked familiar, admitting Tobias couldn't abode breadth he'd apparent that face before. The man was alpine and lean, cutting the aforementioned appearance of dejected shirt Tobias had aloof pulled from the grave. He stood hardly afar from the others, and there was article in his aspect that appropriate tension. On the back of the photo, addition had accounting names in pencil. Jonas, Samuel, Marcus Webb, Theodore Pike, Marcus Webb. Tobias had never heard that name before, but article about it acquainted significant. He advised the man's face again, acquainted the aciculate cheekbones and abysmal set eyes. There was an acuteness there that fabricated Tobias uncomfortable, alike a lofty eon of time. He alternate to the pen as the sun began to set. Chester was lying beside the aperture now, his massive arch comatose abreast the bend as if befitting vigil. Aback he saw Tobias approaching. The pig stood and confused abreast expectantly. Tobias resumed digging, this time with added purpose. The basic were absolutely human. He could accomplish out what appeared to be a complete skeleton lying on its ancillary, in a position that appropriate the actuality had been placed there deliberately. This wasn't addition who had died and been appropriately buried. This was addition who had been hidden, as... He anxiously removed added soil. Tobias apparent added items alloyed in with the remains. A covering belt with a characteristic argent buckle, a brace of beat boots, and article that fabricated his claret run cold. A baby metal brilliant blah with age but still acutely apparent as a sheriff's badge. The brand was engraved with Sheriff Marcus Webb and Anachronous 1923. The aforementioned year is the photograph. The aforementioned man who had stood with his grandfathering and father, cutting the aforementioned dejected shirt that was now captivated about his bones. Tobias sat aback and looked at Chester, who was watching him with those unsettlingly able eyes. Somehow this pig had led him to ascertain that a sheriff from 1923 was active on his family's land. But sheriffs don't aloof abandon and get active in secret. They get murdered. And if Marcus Webb had been asleep and active here, that meant addition and his ancestors knew about it. Addition had put him in the arena and kept the abstruse for over a century. Chester fabricated that atrocious complete again, and this time Tobias understood. The pig wasn't aloof digging randomly. Chester had begun a annihilation that addition had approved actual adamantine to accumulate buried. But as Tobias stared at the sheriff's brand in his abashed hand, he accomplished the best. Alarming allotment wasn't what Chester had found. It was what a ward it meant about his own family's past. Tobias spent the night analytic through every certificate his ancestors had labored behind. Birth certificates, acreage deeds, tax records, annihilation. That ability explained why Sheriff Marcus Webb was active on their land. But the added he searched, the added questions arose. According to the Canton Annal he began in an old trunk. Marcus Webb had been appear missing in September 1923. The official address declared he had abolished while investigating beasts alive in the area. His anatomy was never begin and the case went cold. But Tobias now knew absolutely Breth Webb had concluded up. What abashed him best were the dates. Webb had abolished on September 15, 1923. According to his grandfather's journal, which Tobias had never agitated to apprehend before, that was the exact aforementioned day Jonas Marsh had acquired a cogent bulk of money, abundant to buy the added acreage that had angled the admeasurement of their ranch. The account entries were sparse, but Jonas had written, "The Webb amount is settled. We can move advance now." 3 canicule later, bought the Morrison plot. Our troubles are abaft us. Tobias acquainted Ailing as the implications became clear. His grandfathering hadn't aloof accepted about Webb's disappearance. He had been complex in it, and that captivation had allegedly fabricated the ancestors' affluent abundant to aggrandize their backing significantly. As Aurora broke, Tobias alternate to the pen. Chester was cat and mouse for him, continuing bouncer over the grave like an affectionate sentinel. But article had afflicted overnight. The pig was no best focused on the whole. Instead, Chester kept attractive adjoin the old barn that had stood on the acreage aback his grandfather's time. Afterward, Chester's gaze Tobias absolved to the barn and began analytic areas he'd never paid abundant absorption to. In the loft, abaft endless of moldering hay, he began a metal box that had been hidden for decades. Inside were abstracts that fabricated his easily agitate as he apprehend them. Sheriff Webb hadn't been investigating beasts alive aback he disappeared. He'd been investigating his own deputy, Theodore Pike, the added man in the photograph, for demography bribes from beasts thieves, and according to Webb's notes, Pike had been alive with bounded ranchers to awning up the thefts, including Jonas Marsh. But the best anathema certificate was a letter Webb had written, but never sent, addressed to the territorial marshal. In it he abundant his affirmation adjoined Pike and Jonas Marsh, advertence his ambition to arrest both men on September 15, 1923. The letter was anachronous September 14th. Webb had appeared to arrest his grandfathering and instead had concluded up active in what would become Chester's pen. Jonas Marsh and Theodore Pike had murdered a constable to assure their bent enterprise. Afresh acclimated the profits to buy added acreage and legitimize their operations. Tobias looked aback adjoin the pen breadth Chester connected his accommodating vigil. The pig had somehow sensed the abuse active below the adobe, and had spent canicule aggravating to accompany it to light. A aeon of blackout burst by a pig who banned to let the asleep break hidden, but as Tobias captivated the affirmation of his family's aphotic past, he faced an absurd choice. He could address the analysis and betrayal his grandfather's crimes, antibacterial the acceptability his ancestors had congenital over generations. Or he could rebury the accuracy and let Chester's efforts be in vain. Chester was watching him from aloft the yard, and Tobias could affirm the beastly was cat and mouse to see what affectionate of man he would accept to be. Would he account the law that Webb had died aggravating to uphold? Or would he assure the bequest congenital on that lawman's murder? The pig fabricated that atrocious complete again, and this time it articulate like a appeal for amends that had been cat and mouse 100 years to be heard. Tobias sat on his balustrade for hours, staring at the abstracts that could abort aggregate his ancestors had built. The weight of a aeon-old annihilation apprenticed bottomward on him like a concrete force. Every lath below his feet, every fence column about his property, every advance his ancestor and grandfathering had made, all of it paid for with claret money. Chester had wandered over and now lay at the abject of the balustrade steps, his massive arch comatose on his advanced hooves. The pig's eyes never larbored Tobias's face, as if he accepted the consequence of the accommodation actuality made. The acute affair would be to bake the affirmation and rebury Webb's charcoal about far from the ranch. No one abroad knew what Chester had found. The sheriff's case had been alleged for 100 years. No one was advancing to attending for answers now. Tobias could assure his family's acceptability and accumulate the agronomical that had been his accomplished life. But every time he looked at Chester, He remembered that atrocious cry. Webb had died aggravating to do the appropriate thing, and his analgesic had prospered. For a century, the lawman's anatomy had lain in bare ground, while Jonas Marsh's name was accustomed throughout the canton as a founding ancestor and admired rancher. Tobias' anticipation about Ruth, who had consistently believed in amends aloft convenience. She would accept, told him to do the appropriate affair behindhand of the cost. But Ruth wasn't actuality to face the consequences. She wasn't actuality to watch their life's assignment crumble because of sins committed afore they were born. As the sun accomplished its peak, Tobias began himself walking back to the pen. Chester anon stood and abutting him at the bend of the grave. Together they looked bottomward at the charcoal of Marcus Webb, the sheriff who had approved to accompany Abyss to amends and paid with his life. If you were Tobias, what would you do? Account your family's bequest and rebury the accuracy to assure aggregate you formed for? Or betrayal a aeon-old annihilation and face the abolition of your acceptability and livelihood? Acquaint me in the comments. I charge to apperceive which ancillary you'd choose, because what Tobias abstively abutting would either put this abuse to blow consistently, or assuredly accord Marcus Webb the amends he died aggravating to uphold. Tobias knelt beside the grave and anxiously aerial Webb's badge, activity its weight in his palm. The metal was cold, but somehow it seemed to beating with the ascendancy the man had agitated in life. This wasn't a loofy allotment of tin. It was the attribute of aggregate Webb had stood for. Chester fabricated a bendable balance and stepped closer, acute his bill-a-claim adjoined Tobias's shoulder. The action acquainted about like comfort, as if the pig accepted the adversity of the choice but additionally knew what bare to be done. Tobias looked about his ranch, the acreage that had abiding 3 ancestors of his family, the home breadth he'd planned to alive out his days, all of it congenital on a foundation of annihilation and corruption, abide to account for the abomination that had destroyed an acceptable man's life. But as he stood up, brand in hand, Tobias noticed article abroad in the grave that he'd absent before. Article that would accomplish his accommodation alike, added complicated and added dangerous. Tucked below Webb's ribcage was a baby covering pouch. And from what Tobias could see, it independent added than aloof claimed effects. Whatever was in that accessory ability authority secrets that went far aloft his grandfather's captivation in the sheriff's death. If you're adequate the story, subscribe to the channel. Chester was staring at the pouch too, and his announcement had afflicted from atrocious to urgent. The pig knew there was added to discover, and somehow Tobias doubtable that what they begin abutting would accomplish aggregate abroad assume simple by comparison. With abashed hands, Tobias anxiously extracted the covering accessory from below Webb's remains. The actual was able-bodied, preserved by the adobe soil, and as he opened it, his animation bent in his throat. Inside weren't aloof claimed effects. There were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be an abundant map of the absolute county. The photographs showed things that fabricated Tobias's abdomen turn. Images of beasts with brands that had been altered. Groups of men loading base-born livestock assimilate trains. And best anathema of all, bright pictures of Theodore Pike and Jonas Marsh administering the operations. Webb hadn't aloof been investigating bush beasts rustling. He'd bald-headed a massive organized annexation arena that connected aloft 3 counties. But it was the map that fabricated aggregate clear. Red X's apparent locations throughout the breadth with dates and numbers accounting beside anniversary 1. Tobias accustomed several of the locations as ranches that had belonged to his grandfather's business partners. Men who had mysteriously prospered during the aforementioned aeon. Jonas Marsh had broadcast his holdings. At the basal of the accessory was the account of names, and Tobias's claret ran algid as he apprehended them. These weren't aloof-bounded ranchers. They included the territorial governor, 2 federal marshals, and the railroad commissioner. Webb had apparent that the Beasts Alive operation was actuality adequate at the accomplished levels of government. Chester apprenticed closer, as if analysis the consequence of what had been uncovered. This wasn't aloof about his grandfather's crimes anymore. Webb had died because he'd apparent bribery that accomplished all the way to the territorial capital. His annihilation hadn't aloof silenced one honest lawman. It had accustomed an absolute arrangement of abyss to abide operating for decades. Amid the abstracts was Webb's final address accounting in accurate autography, and addressed to the U.S. Marshal account in Denver. In it, he abundant how base-born beasts were actuality confused through an arrangement of base officials, awash to government contractors and the profits aggregate amid anybody from bounded ranchers to territorial politicians. The operation was to count hundreds of bags of dollars, a affluence in 1923. But what abashed Tobias best was the ability that the bribery hadn't concluded with Webb's death. Attractive at the names on the list, he accustomed ancestors' names that still captivated ability in the canton today. Birth of the Aboriginal conspirators now served as mayors, judges, and business leaders. The arrangement Webb had died aggravating to betrayal had artlessly acquired and continued. As he advised, the map added carefully, Tobias noticed article that fabricated his affection race. Several of the apparent locations corresponded to areas breath-added ranchers had appear award beastly charcoal over the years. Discoveries that had been bound absolved by bounded authorities as old Indian burying breadth or abandoned graves from the territorial period. Webb hadn't been the alone actuality murdered to assure this conspiracy. The map appropriate at Atomic 6 added locations breadth bodies ability be buried, all apparent with dates amid 1923 and 1925. The Beasts Alive arena had alone anyone who airish a threat, and the affirmation had been broadcast aloft the territory. Chester fabricated that burning complete afresh and began walking adjoin the barn. Back Tobias followed. The pig led him to a breadth of attic that looked adapted from the rest. Newer boards that had acutely been replaced at some point. Chester began pawing at the boards aloof as he had done at the gravesite. Tobias pried up the AFAR boards and began addition ambuscade place. This one absolute a metal label box. Inside were endless of money, added banknote than Tobias had any time apparent in one place. But it wasn't avant-garde currency. These were bills and bill from the 1920s. Apparently Webb's affirmation of the payoffs that kept the cabal functioning. A agenda absorbed to the money was accounting in his grandfather's handwriting. Payment for casework rendered. The Webb botheration is permanent. T. Pike sends his regards. The date was September 16, 1923, one day afterwards Webb's disappearance. Tobias now accepted the abounding ambit of what Chester had uncovered. His grandfathering hadn't aloof alternate in Beasts Alive and murder. He had been paid amply to advise awning up the crimes. The amplification of their agronomical hadn't been adjourned by accepted success, but by claret money from a cabal that had claimed assorted lives. And about out there, the birth of the added conspirators were still benefiting from abundance congenital, on a foundation of annihilation and corruption. Absolutely blind that a pig alleged Chester had aloof apparent the accuracy they anticipation was active forever. Tobias spent the abutting morning authoritative copies of every document, photograph, and allotment of affirmation Webb had gathered. He photographed the badge, the money, and alike the map with its anathema red X's appearance burying sites aloft the county. If he was activity to betrayal this conspiracy, he bare to ensure the affirmation couldn't be destroyed or dismissed. Chester followed him everywhere, as if compassionate that his analysis had set article momentous in motion. The pig's behavior had alternate to accustomed in every way except one. He banned to leave Tobias's side as admitting he sensed crisis approaching. That afternoon, Tobias collection into boondocks to appointment the Canton Actual Society. He bare to verify the names on Webb's account and accept how abounding of the families mentioned still captivated ability in the area. What he apparent fabricated his accommodation inevitable. Martha Kellerman, the aged historian, was acquisitive to advice aback Tobias mentioned researching his family's history. But aback he showed her photocopies of some of the names from Webb's documents, her announcement afflicted dramatically. "Where did you acquisition these names together?" she asked, her articulation bottomward to a whisper. "Old ancestors' papers," Tobias replied carefully. "Why?" Martha looked about nervously, afresh leaned closer. "My grandfathering acclimated to a quaint belief about a bribery aspersion in the 1920s, he said. Sheriff Webb was accepting a budding to advertisement article big aback he disappeared, but anyone who approved to investigate added, seemed to accept accidents or abstively to leave boondocks suddenly. She pulled out a blubbery binder from a bound cabinet. "I've been researching this for years, but I never had abundant affirmation to prove anything. These families you're allurement about, their birth still run this county. The accepted mayor, the brand chief, 2 of the canton commissioners, alike the commune attorney. They're all descended from bodies on your list." Tobias acquainted the weight of Webb's brand in his pocket. The cabal hadn't aloof survived. It had acquired into a political absolutism that controlled bounded law administration and government. Advertisement the accuracy wouldn't aloof acknowledge actual crimes. It would abuse the ability anatomy that had disqualified the canton for a century, There's article else, Martha whispered. 3 bodies except approved to analysis this adventure in the accomplished 20 years. 1 had a car accident. 1 confused abroad afterwards accepting threats. And 1 artlessly disappeared. If your cerebration of advancing this, you charge to be actual accurate about who you trust. As Tobias' collection home, he noticed a atramentus barter afterward him at a distance. Aback he angry assimilate his agronomical road. The barter connected past, but he bent a glimpse of the driver. A man cutting a brand uniform. Addition was already watching him. That evening, as he sat on his balustrade reviewing the affirmation one aftermost time, Tobias heard cartage approaching. 3 trucks pulled into his backyard and men climbed out. Men he accustomed as bounded businessmen and officials. Leading them was Brand Arch Raymond Pike, abundant grandson of Theodore Pike, the base abettor who Annihilation Web. Black Tobias, Arch Pike alleged out, his Duke comatose accidentally on his account weapon. Heard you've been allurement questions about old ancestors' history. A perception if we accept a chat? Chester emerged from abaft the house, Accession himself amid Tobias and the visitors. The pig's anatomy accent was acutely threatening, his hackles aloft and a low bark cavernous from his throat. Alike in the face of armed men, Chester was accessible to assure the man who had listened to his warnings. We apperceive what you found, Pike continued, dispatch closer. And we apperceive you've been authoritative copies. That was a mistake, Tobias. A big mistake. Tobias stood slowly, Activity Webb's brand in his abridged encerebration about the lawman who had died aggravating to betrayal these aforementioned families a aeon ago. History was repeating itself, but this time there was the attestant who couldn't be silenced. The absolute canton would anon apperceive the accuracy, because Tobias had already mailed copies of aggregate to newspapers and law administration agencies, al fresco the county's influence. Too late, Tobias said simply. The accuracy is already out there. Pike's announcement blurred as he accomplished he was adverse the aforementioned bearings his great-grandfather had faced in 1923. But clashing Webb, Tobias had able for this moment, and Chester wasn't activity to let addition acceptable man abandon afterwards a fight. The collision lasted alone moments afore the complete of sirens abounding the air. Federal agents and accompaniment board cake to simulate the ranch, surrounding Pike and his men afore they could react. Tobias had spent the morning not aloof authoritative copies, but calling every law administration bureau al fresco the county's influence. Pike's face went anemic as he accomplished the allurement had bankrupt about him. You accept no abstraction what you've done, he snarled. Do you apperceive how abounding families your activity to destroy? I apperceive absolutely what I've done, Tobias replied, Affairs Webb's brand from his pocket. I've accustomed Marcus Webb the amends he died aggravating to achieve. The federal agents confused quickly, arresting Pike and his assembly, while accepting the affirmation Tobias had gathered. Special abettor Sarah Mitchell, who led the team, advised Webb's abstracts with growing amazement. This is the best complete affirmation of actual bribery we've any time encountered, she told Tobias. Your pig didn't aloof acquisition a annihilation victim. He bald-headed what ability be the longest active bent cabal in territorial history. Chester watched the affairs with what could alone be declared as satisfaction. As the base admiral were led abroad in handcuffs, the pig alternate to his pen and laid bottomward affably for the aboriginal time in weeks. His assignment was assuredly done. The analysis that followed fabricated civic headlines. Webb's affirmation led to the analysis of 6 added burying sites aloft 3 counties, absolutely as his map had indicated. DNA testing accepted the identities of several victims, added law administration officers, journalists, and honest admiral who had threatened the cabal over the years. Ambassador Patricia Kellerman, Commune Apostle Robert Morrison, and 12 added admiral were arrested as the analysis expanded. The arrangement Webb had died aggravating to betrayal assuredly burst below the weight of affirmation. A pig had banned to let break buried. Martha Kellerman, the historian, became the key attestant in answer how the cabal had acquired over generations. The anticipation they were safe because they'd active the truth, she testified. But accuracy has a way of surfacing aback you atomic apprehend it. The trials lasted 2 years and resulted in dozens of convictions. Acreage bedeviled from the cabal was account millions of dollars. Abundance accumulated over an eon of corruption. Abundant of it was alternate to the families of victims or donated to law administration training programs. Tobias faced a difficult best about his ranch, which had been broadcast application claret money. Afterwards connected consideration. He donated the added acreage his grandfathering had purchased with Webb's annihilation money to authorize the Marcus Webb Memorial Park, complete with a able grave for the sheriff and monuments to all the conspiracy's victims. Chester lived out his canicule as article of a celebrity, featured in newspapers and television programs as the pig who apparent a eon-old murder. Visitors came from all off the country to accommodate the beastly who had banned to let abuse break buried. Chester seemed to adore the attention, admitting he never afresh showed any absorption in digging. If you're adequate the story, subscribe to the channel. Tobias kept a abate allocation of the Aboriginal agronomical and connected farming, but his activity had afflicted completely. He became an apostle for algid case investigations and formed with law administration agencies to break added actual crimes. The acquaintance had accomplished him that sometimes the best important affair you can do is accept a back someone. Like a pig, is aggravating to acquaint you, article important. Years later, a backbodies asked him how he'd begin the adventuresomeness to betrayal his own family's crimes. Tobias would consistently acclaim Chester. He showed me that some truths are too important to break buried, he would say. And that amends doesn't accept in cessation date. Chester lived to be 14 years old, casual affably in his sleep. Aback the act of him, Tobias placed a baby replica of Webb's brand beside him. It seemed applicable that the pig who had brought a murdered constable amends should backpack a brand of account into whatever comes afterwards this life. The Marcus Webb case became archetypal for investigating actual corruption, and Chester's adventure aggressive dozens of algid case reopenings aloft the country. Sometimes amends takes a eon to arrive, but it arrives nonetheless. Especially aback you accept a bent pig who refuses to accord up digging for the truth. Now bang on the video on the awning to apprehend a adventure alike bigger than this one, with a aberration so able you won't balloon it anytime soon. Bang on the video,